Can you draw on watercolor paper? Actually, a lot of professional artists draw on watercolor paper. Welcome to my channel, guys. Today we are drawing a realistic cat portrait on hot press watercolor paper. I compared all the drawing papers before. You can check it out right here. I have a big library of real-time tutorials on my Patreon. If you want to check it out, patreon.com/Ece Gurler. Let's draw. First, I would like to talk to you about drawing papers. The first one I want to talk about is my favorite, Strathmore Bristol 300 series vellum surface. It's 270 gram per meter square. It's so thick that I thought this was two paper here, but apparently it's just one. And you can see that this is as thick as watercolor paper and it's really white. I'm going to test it out. I have sketch drawing paper right here. It is pretty thin. It's like a printing paper, but I will tell you how heavy it is. It is actually, yes, 89 gram per meter square. So it is pretty thin. It is a little bit see-through as well. I recommend sketch paper for your quick sketches, but for your finished drawings, probably you need a thicker paper. Strathmore drawing paper 400 series is another one. It is 130 gram per meter square. It's very typical for a drawing paper. It is heavyweight, so it doesn't feel light like sketch paper at all. The only thing I don't like about this paper is how yellow it looks. When you compare with vellum paper, you see it even more. Now I'm going to test all of them out, but I have one more paper for you. Used Watercolor Paper. It is a pretty good paper. It's hot press, and you will see that it's 300 gram per meter square. It is white color, and this is another drawing paper that we will compare today. I'm going to draw my cat portrait on this, and you can see it is pretty thick. It is hard to bend, and when you compare with vellum paper, they're actually very similar. Their color is a little bit different. Watercolor paper is a little bit off-white, and the vellum paper is also pretty thick, pretty hard to bend. Now I'm going to shade a little bit with my 5B pencil on vellum paper, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the watercolor paper, and I'm going to compare. You will see that both of them showing tooth of the paper, and I can't see any difference here. Honestly, they are showing the grainy tooth underneath. When I do the same thing to the drawing paper, I got the almost same result. You can see all that tooth showing, but for the sketch paper, when I make the same application, you can see that there's not much tooth showing because it is more fine surface. So because of that, there's more grainy look on drawing paper, whereas a little bit more black result on the sketch one. Because the sketch one yielded a very different result, let's compare very similar ones. When you look at vellum watercolor paper and drawing paper, the first thing you notice is the color difference. The paper colors are very different. Now I'm blending it with my blending stump, applying the same pressure, and honestly, I think I got the same result. I didn't see much difference here. Now I'm going to try to blend them with the clean part of my tissue and see if there are any results when I blend them with my tissue, because blending stump and tissue are two different type of blending tools. When I compare the vellum paper and watercolor paper, I realized watercolor paper showed more grains, especially in the blended part, and the vellum paper resulted in a much smoother look. When we compare drawing paper with watercolor paper though, we got almost identical results. You can see the tooth of the paper in both in equal amounts. So when we compare them all, I think vellum would be my first choice, and watercolor paper would be my second, and drawing paper would be my third. Now, let's not forget graphite pencils differ among the brands as well. Let me show you how. This is 5B from H&B brand. I'm going to apply just lightly and then medium amount, and I'm going to also have a heavy application. Let me write the brand name. And on the other hand, I have Derwent Graphic, another graphite pencil set. I'm using the same degree, 5B. Again, I'm applying lightly in medium amount and I'm making heavy application. Let's compare the results. So if you look at it, I know they're very similar, but I do think H&B is a little bit darker. You can see this especially in the medium one and the darkest one. Sorry about the camera focus, by the way. Let's blend them and see if there are any differences. So I'm blending them with the clean part of my tissue. And in the end, I realized H&B ended up smudging more graphite around. And it yielded in much darker results. Especially in the medium and lightest one, you can see that it is much darker than Derwent. Now, this doesn't mean one is better than the other, it just depends on what the artist is looking for. Another question I get a lot is I draw with charcoal a lot, not with graphite, and what the reason is. Honestly, I love charcoal, just like in this dog portrait, because it creates a much better contrast than graphite does. This cat portrait will be done with graphite and you can see the difference. When you're drawing realistically, I think creating contrast is the key, and I feel like I have more power creating contrast with my charcoal pencil than my graphite pencils. Do you see the difference? What do you think? Now let's draw a realistic cat by using only graphite pencils. So in watercolor paper, you have to be ready for the grainy look. So if you're looking for a smooth skin result like a baby's skin, it's not going to work on watercolor paper. I think watercolor paper is particularly good for animal portraits since we don't really need smooth skin. You can see here that I blended and it worked really well. It was really easy. I also blended with tissue and a blending stump during my study and I had zero problems. It is very easy to draw fur. I didn't have any problems when I was drawing the fur one by one like this with my pencil, because the graphite stays on the paper perfectly. But when you do the pencil stroke, the first point is going to look a little bit darker than the tip of the hair. You can basically smoothen this out by blending or using your eraser. Speaking of erasing was super easy as well. You can see that I'm using my Tombow Mono eraser here with ease. However, I have to tell you this, if you erase a lot and then add more layers and erase one more time, what happens that you lose the tooth very easily, which means you can see that the paper is getting damaged. This doesn't happen in drawing papers as quickly as it happens in watercolor paper. Well, you know the drill. If we are drawing fur, we always sharpen our pencils to give the realistic effect. So I had to sharpen my pencil quite often. The finer the tip of your pencil, the better the effect will get. Of course, we need to follow the direction of the hair, direction of the fur, especially on the head. You will see there are different directions of the fur, so we have to follow that. Also, please don't forget to pay attention to the length of the fur. Creating contrast. As I said before, I love creating contrast in my realistic drawings because that gives the perfect effect. How do you do that with graphite pencils? Is basically going over the darkest areas one more time and highlighting the highlights at the end, very last time. So you see around the eye here and around the nose, I darkened up all the areas so that I could create a nice contrast. Doing the background was so easy on watercolor paper because the graphite smudged so easily. I loved it. It was really smooth. So we had to do the background first before we add the fur on top of it because, you know, our cat is in front of the background and the fur needs to go on that background. After making the fur with the help of our eraser pencil, now we are moving down to the nose. We are giving all these hair details around the mouth and around the nose. We will do the whiskers last. You know why? Because usually whiskers go over every part of the cat. So before we make the whiskers, we have to make sure that everything is completely finished. Drawing in clumps. So what we do with the lower part of our cat is drawing the hair in clumps instead of drawing the hair one by one. You can see that they are actually coming together towards the end, and they just create these beautiful clumps of hair. After we finish outlining them with our eraser pencil, we go in with our darker pencil, which is 5B in this case, and darken up the areas between those clumps. Of course, we need to follow the hair direction because they go from top to bottom in this case. They are very different than the hair directions on the face. When I'm darkening up, I'm not putting any pressure and I'm just making sure that I'm not leaving any pencil strokes. So the power of blending stump. Every blending tool has a different purpose. What blending stump does is basically darkening up all those lines and blend them beautifully into each other. Here, this is exactly why I use blending stump, not a tissue or a Q-tip. Here you see that all those darker areas are even darker now and they're not losing their hairy, furry look. So time for the final details. As the final details, I added more fur, I added more shadows on the darkest parts, I darkened up the area around the eye. I also added some more fur with my eraser pencil. I just wanted to make sure we are completely finished with the parts that we want to give final touch up before we add the whiskers. I usually do the whiskers with gel pen, but because this was a graphite drawing, not a charcoal drawing, my white gel pen didn't really work. It kept sliding and not leaving a mark. Even though I tried on the tape of my drawing, like here, it was not working on the drawing. Why, you ask? Think about the surface of your paper as valleys and hills. So when your graphite pencil goes in and starts drawing, it fills all the valleys with graphite. What happens in the end, if you fill in too much, then everywhere is graphite. Graphite is very slippery actually, and there's no room for the white gel pen anymore because of this slippery texture of graphite, and all the hills and valleys are filled. There is no room. But what you do is you just use a little bit of graphite instead of too much. Then your white gel pen can come in and fill in all the valleys in between the hills. Then you will have the perfect result. This wasn't my case because apparently I put in too much graphite. So what I did instead was erasing them. This is another method to do whiskers. You can basically just use your eraser pencil. Easy removal of the masking tape. Because masking tapes are usually made for watercolor papers, it was perfect. It was so easy to use. I hope you liked this tutorial, guys, and you found it helpful. Please share your comments in the comments section. I am looking forward to them. See you next week. Bye! Thanks for watching my video. If you like my videos, please don't forget to subscribe. And for my real-time narrated tutorials, visit my Patreon, patreon.com/Ece Gurler. Stay with art and love.